Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton. Before we get started, I would like to express my gratitude to those of you who are still listening to me. I went quite a bit overboard last episode with some mean-spirited cynicism. Those of you who reached out to me about that, I would like to thank you for calling me out on my bullshit and giving me some very quality criticism. Also, before we get started, if you are one of those listeners who catches each episode as it drops, we will be going on a short hiatus due to the holidays. After this episode, we're going to have a few weeks without episodes. I don't know exactly when the next episode will drop, but it'll be sometime around the middle of January. So thank you for joining me. Today, I'm going to be talking about better house rules for D&D 5e, better in my opinion. If you haven't listened to episode 135, I want to thank you and advise you not to do so. If you want to try to find my good advice, you can find it in the show notes here in this episode, because I'll summarize my good advice right now. My only real good advice was my alternate system for handling encumbrance, and I'll be putting that in the description for this episode. So you can find a Google document linking to my summary or my rules for the carrying slot system that I worked out for. Well, it works for D&D 5e, but there's quite a few other game systems that it can work with very little modification. So what am I going to be talking about today? Well, I'm going to be talking about rules that I've worked with, that I've used as a DM. And I'll be talking about ones that haven't worked, why they haven't worked. I'll be also discussing some rules that are very particular to a style of game. My most often used example last time was rules that I have for my Dark Sun campaign setting that I like to run, because I feel like Dark Sun setting is a really good one for trying out some really gritty rules for D&D. I'm going to be restricting my advice to rule systems that I have personally used as a GM. I'm not going to be talking about any house rules that I have solely been a player as, because I feel it's a bit disingenuous to talk smack about house rules that I have never really thought would be good to begin with the caveat that there are a few house rules or optional rules that are in the DMG that are very popular, and I am actually going to be talking about in this episode very briefly. But other than that, the house rules that were presented to me as a player and I never carried over into my own games, I'm not going to be talking about. I also want to upfront explain what I mean, because there's several times I'm going to be saying that a particular rule or house rule is a pain in the ass. Usually, what I'm going to mean is that this is something that fixes an issue or a so-called issue that only the DM cares about. A lot of the house rules that I have either used or I have seen used, it seems like they fall into this category where the DM wants the rules of D&D 5e to do something that they don't do out of the book, and whenever it gets put into the rules, it's just something that adds extra headache onto the players because the players just don't care. The other type of pain in the ass is something that the supposed benefit for it is nowhere near the amount of work that it brings into the game itself. There's some overlap between the two of those, and personally, my experience is that most of the house rules that have failed fall into both of those categories. They meet both of those criteria, that I was the only one at the table who cared about it, and it created so much extra work that it just wasn't worth it in the end. Something else that I'll be talking about a little bit is giving some consideration to some of the house rules that I use only whenever I am playing face-to-face, and the ones that I only use whenever I am on a digital platform on usually a virtual tabletop, because there are some rules that are very easy to implement at a face-to-face game and nigh impossible for me personally to implement in a digital format, particularly house rules or rules changes that would require me to change some amount of the coding that goes into the virtual tabletop in order to manipulate the way that the dice come out. So I'll be talking about that, and for this episode, I'm mostly going to be focusing on stuff that appears either in the Dungeon Master's Guide or supplemental things that I've implemented for running monsters or how to handle monsters to make it, well, in my opinion, better. So to start off, I'm going to be talking about encounters, some of the house rules that I use for encounters. And this first one isn't really a house rule. It's more of a 4th edition rule that I just carry over into 5th edition, and that is the use of skill challenges. When I first saw skill challenges in 4th edition, they made total sense to me. I loved them right out the gate. It took me a little bit to kind of work out how exactly to run them, and I feel like in a lot of ways I'm still grappling with that, but I love skill challenges. And what I mean by a skill challenge is, in my games, usually a skill challenge is going to be a social event. It's going to be a social interaction. But I've also run skill challenges for dealing with puzzles, or dealing with overland travel, dealing with terrain issues, things that aren't combat can be often translated into a skill challenge. Anything that would require the use of things that are on the character sheet that don't involve combat can be rolled into a skill challenge in one way or another. And social interaction is the easiest way I can explain how to run a skill challenge. So the way, if you've never played 4th edition, the way you run a skill challenge is you come up with the encounter and you look at the list of skills and tools and other abilities that a player may have that would be relevant to the situation, and can also include spells, but mostly we're focusing on skills and tools. And you basically build an encounter so that instead of attacking enemies, they are making skill checks. So for instance, a social encounter might have use of the persuasion skill and the intimidation skill and the insight skill as the major skills that are in play during the course of a social interaction. And for this, I'm going to use the specific example of doing a diplomatic negotiation. So I identify that persuasion, intimidation, and insight are going to be the dominant skills in the encounter. I will have one particular player become the leader in the encounter, and this is going to be the player who is making the primary roles throughout the course of the encounter. If I run the encounter over the course of several rounds, then they will be the one making the major roles each round. They will be the one rolling either intimidation, persuasion, or insight. And I break the encounter down into a series of rounds. The number of rounds that an encounter may go entirely depends on how well the player characters roll. As a rule of thumb, I want for a skill challenge to require 3 successes before having 3 failures on their rolls. And I let the result of the die rolls, whether they get a success or whether they get a failure, kind of play into the give and take flow of the encounter, and whether or not the tension is rising or whether the player characters are just banging through the encounter without encountering any difficulties. So I have one player being the primary person in the encounter. Everybody else will have a role in the encounter as well, or ideally everybody else. And the role that those other players have will depend on what skills they think what skills and tools and abilities they think would be relevant in the encounter. So, as an example, doing a diplomatic negotiation, all of the other players, they may work in things organically into the situation in order to improve the role that the main character is eventually going to make for the round. So they could also make diplomacy or intimidation or insight checks in order to boost up the primary character's roles. I usually do this with just giving out +2 for every success. But also other skills may play into it. And I don't plan out what those other skills may be. I'll let the players come up with, well, I think that me knowing some history of the type of people that we are dealing with, can I make a history check in order to gain some sort of knowledge about what they want in what they have historically wanted and use that to play into this interaction? Yes, I'll let that player make a history check for that round. And so we're not just limited to those 3 skills that I've mentioned in this encounter. Anything that makes sense in the situation can be rolled. And so all of the supplemental characters, all of the other characters besides the primary character, they'll make rolls, and if they get a success, then they'll be giving a boost to the primary character's roll. Usually it's a +2. I also like to have role-playing going on during each round. So the player characters will be talking about what the verbal tactics that they are using in this conversation. And when it comes down to it, I'll have the primary character, make their argument as to what they're going to talk about to represent this next upcoming role. And depending on the strength of what I think is the strength of the argument, I may give an additional bonus on the role that they are about to make. And then the player rolls, and I usually roll for the opponents. If they're in a social interaction, I'll roll an opposing roll. And whether the player characters succeed or whether they fail, they'll either make some headway or they'll meet some sort of obstacle in the negotiation, and each round repeats the cycle. This allows for a lot of role playing. It allows for a lot of getting into character, and for players who love to talk in character, that it gives them a chance to say the quippy things, the insightful things, the cutting things to each other and to the opponents in the discussion, and it allows everybody at the table to participate in some way. So that's a very general way in which I will run skill challenges in 5th edition. Another house rule that I have used, well, I don't even know if I would really consider it a house rule. The DMG gives some guidelines on building an encounter and building it based on the challenge system. And I've got a few years of experience in D&D, specifically 5th edition. And at this point, I really don't use the challenge system anymore. I have seen it fall apart as a guideline, giving really weird results of having an encounter that is worth a paltry amount of experience points be something that nearly kills the player characters. And I've had some that should be a deadly encounter, and the player characters just steamroll through it like nothing, like tearing through it like tissue paper. So I've encountered that enough times, and I've also just gotten a good feel for 5th edition that I don't use the challenge system anymore. Besides the encounters themselves, I don't just consider, since I'm using skill challenges, it really opens up the amount of things that can give experience points to the players. If I am even using experience as a way of tracking levels, I go back and forth as to whether or not I use the experience system. The DMG gives some guidelines on using milestones, giving story rewards or story-based level advancement. I really like doing this. It really allows you to build up an entire adventure and not have to worry about whether or not the player characters gain all of the all of the experience points needed in order to gain a level. And I like using milestones. And this is something in the DMG that kind of falls into the 5th edition philosophy of doing rulings rather than rules. And in particular, I will use milestones more often in face-to-face games because it eliminates the headache of keeping track of experience points, because I, as a DM and a player, hate keeping track of experience points. Rules as written, I feel that keeping track of experience points is a pain in the ass. I always have at least one player who forgets to write down when experience points is given. And I'm not saying this as a dig on the player. I have been that player who has forgotten to write down experience points for an entire session. And if you just forget, I feel like it's an unnecessary punishment to you that you are suddenly behind the other characters if you do forget. In an extreme example that I have seen it turn off casual players when they realize that, oh, they have failed at D&D because they didn't keep track and calculate their experience points accurately. I've been in a situation where a player who has only missed one session suddenly realizes that they are 2 full levels or more behind all of the other player characters, including players who have missed several sessions. And it just leaves a bad taste in my mouth that a player is punished for sometimes just not having the gall to go and use the bathroom and be out of the room when the DM says how many experience points they earn in an encounter. So because I don't like tracking experience points in face-to-face games, I'll come back to this in a little bit when I talk about digital games, virtual games. But so what I like to use in face-to-face games is, I really like doing experience-based encounters where each encounter is just worth an amount of experience points. I'll usually calculate it ahead of time. And instead of having each player track experience points, I, the DM, am just keeping track of experience points, and I let the players know whenever they gain a level. This removes a lot of the headache for the players, and it also allows me to kind of allow myself to forget to give out experience points, because that's something that I do. I may go an entire session and realize, oh shit, the last 3 encounters, I never said how much experience points was gained, and now I've got to go back and recalculate that. And let's see, were there 4 or 5 of those monsters that they fought? I don't remember, and it's not written down in my notes because I randomly rolled how many creatures were in that encounter. Well, shit, now I'm potentially cheating the players of experience points because I kept crappy notes as a DM. I also go back and forth as to whether or not I think it's right or, quote, fair that a player who misses a session should be behind the other player characters. Sometimes players miss sessions for very, very valid reasons, like yeah, I know the real life shit you are going through right now, and I don't blame you for not being able to make it to our fun time. So I don't like punishing players who have real life things going on in their lives. But then again, there are also some players who are just flaky. And in that instance, I do feel like it's entirely justified that if you've flaked for 3 sessions, then you should be a little behind the other players. Part of why I play is to have that social interaction with the other players, to all get together and do this thing that we all enjoy. And I want to reward all of my good friends who are here with me having a great time. And if somebody flakes and can't make it, well, I mean, that's a consequence of you not being there to be there with us. Be there to be there with us. Yep. I'm glad I'm not getting paid for this. So back to digital tools. Digital tools is one of those places where I still hang on to keeping track of experience points, because it is so easy to keep track of the information that way. Whenever I run on Roll20, I will make a dedicated thread to keeping track of experience points and loot. Loot kind of gets lumped in here because that's another thing that I forget to do a lot. So whenever I'm doing a game on Roll20, I almost always use experience points, just because I have a record that is kept on the website of all of the experience points that each player is getting as they are getting it. Between each game, I will go through and I will add to the thread stating what the experience points total is. That way, at any point, if there is any discrepancy in the number of points that somebody has, they can go back and they can recalculate. They can look through the thread, because I label each session, I label who all has been there, and I make an itemized list of all of the things that the player characters gained experience for in that session. So it is very easy to go back through and recalculate the number of experience points you should have at a given time for your character. The next thing that I've made changes to is with treasure. I really like the crafting rules that exist as well. I hybridized the crafting rules between what the very scant amount that is given in the DMG and also the information that is in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. I've kind of hybridized and kind of made my own adjustments to the crafting system in order to have it so that I can give out monster parts as loot. Whenever the players kill a monster that ordinarily wouldn't carry a bunch of money, like a lot of just feral monsters, like why in the hell would a Hydra have a bunch of coinage? I break the monster down and I'll say, like, okay, at the end of the fight, somebody can make me an Arcana check, and whether or not you succeed on that roll, usually the difficulty check of the Arcana roll is based on the challenge of the monster. So I will have the player roll to see whether or not they know if anything on the monster can fetch them some money, is worth anything. And I will also tell them whether or not those items, those monster parts, could be useful in crafting potions or magical items. And then I'll have another player make usually a survival roll or a medicine check in order to actually harvest those parts from the monster for later use or just later to sell. The way I then use the monster parts is that if you want to use them in the crafting of potions or magic items, they will give a significant bonus either by eliminating some of the money cost going into the item or reducing the amount of time that it takes in order to craft an item, or maybe both, usually both. And I try to tie the monster parts into the magic items in a way that makes sense. So, for example, if the player characters are chopping up some sort of monster that had dark vision, I'll let the players know, yeah, you can harvest the eyes and make potions of dark vision with that, and the potions of dark vision will be very, very cheap to make, both in time and money. And I've also expanded the list of potions that are available. Generally, I will allow pretty much any beneficial spell to be made into a potion that has an effect on you when you drink it. But I have a love-hate relationship with consumable items. I've kind of made allusions to it in the past on previous episodes, kind of how like at the end of Final Fantasy games, I am the type of player who at the end of the game, having completed the game, I'll realize I have like 99 mega elixirs because I never use them, because I always have the mentality of I'm going to save this for when I really need it, and then actually get to the final fight and never actually needing it. And I do the exact same thing in D&D 5e. As an example, I was playing in Kyle's Wanderers game, and each of our characters had a potion of invulnerability, I think. And basically what that does is it reduces all damage by half for the duration of the potion. I never used it. Even when I was in the final fight of the campaign, I knew it was the final fight of the campaign. I still ended up not using it. Why? I could not tell you why I didn't use it, besides the fact that most of the time I just forget that consumable items even exist. So I think that for me, consumable items just kind of suck, but they are great little things to toss out to the players because the players always feel like they're getting something. They're getting something that they can then hoard. I've noticed that a lot of players are just reluctant to use things. Anything that is generally consumable, I've noticed that a lot of players, myself included, just don't use them. And this isn't just potions, this is also scrolls, and this is also money. I also lump money into the usable stuff that they get and just never use. It seems like D&D is just this constant grind of gaining more and more and more, and there's not really any incentive to spend those things. Not quite sure where I was going with that, just kind of making an observation about why consumable items can be great, but also why they kind of suck a little bit. Next, I'm going to be talking about criticals, critical hits, but also critical fumbles. My house rule for critical hits is I personally don't like being able to get a critical hit and then rolling 2 1s for damage. So the way I get around this is whenever you get a critical hit, instead of rolling 2 dice, you just roll 1 weapon dice, but the theoretical other dice you would roll, that is assumed to be a maximum. So if you are wielding a longsword in one hand, then you get a crit, then you automatically have an 8 in damage that you are doing from the critical. Then you roll to see how much additional damage from the weapon die. I don't use any other bonus damage in this. I feel like it's too powerful to use in conjunction with sneak attack and smite and like magic weapons like flaming swords. Those types of things are just dealt with normally. It doubles the number of dice that you roll because it's really fun to be able to roll a big chunk of dice. I feel like it's a little too unbalancing to get a hit because I've played a high-level paladin. High-level paladins can unleash a goddamn high amount of damage whenever they crit and they smite. So to prevent a very climactic fight from being just I deal a single critical hit and deal a shit ton of damage, I still keep the rules as written for sneak attack, smite, and magic weapons. I do this, and this is an example of a rule that I don't use in virtual tabletops, just because I don't know how to change the algorithm that calculates critical damage. So this is an example of a rule that I wish I could implement into Roll20, but I don't know how I would implement it. I'm sure I could look it up and put it in there, but I don't feel like the benefit of putting it in there, looking up how to put it in there, and then actually putting it in there, I don't think it's worth the extra effort that it would cost. I don't think the benefit is worth the extra effort. I've also played around with critical fumbles, critical fumble tables and charts and critical hit tables and charts. to do something other than dealing additional damage, or in the case of fumbles, just a guaranteed miss. And the more that I play with critical hits and critical fumbles, the more I don't like the way it's implemented. So I just stick with critical hits with the one house rule that I have, and critical failures being a 1 on an attack roll. For the most part, I feel like it just takes way too much time, especially if you've got to consult a table or some other source to figure out what the critical hit does. And I also feel like both the critical hits and the critical fumbles unfairly are applied to the players much more often than to the monsters. Though the style in which I run most of my encounters is that the players will be encountering more monsters. I never throw a solo monster at the player characters unless it is something that I know for a fact that they are going to be in for a big fight with that solo monster. When it comes down to action economy, the players can do so much against a solo enemy and literally stun lock it to where it can't do hardly anything throughout the entirety of a combat, and they take down a creature that is designed to be much, much more powerful than them, and they take it down without a sweat. I've had that happen too many times. So I always present, especially big bads, I always give them minions. And I'll talk about minions later. I give the players more things to think about in combat than just one single enemy. So I've played with the idea of having critical hits and critical fumbles be something that only players deal with. And I generally don't like doing things that apply to players only. I don't like those types of rules. It's been hard enough for me to come to grips with the 5e philosophy that monsters don't abide by the same rules as the player characters, that I personally don't agree with the philosophy, and I don't like implementing rules that make it even more so. That's one thing that I really liked about 3rd edition, is that if you could build a player character, you could build a monster. So I generally don't do any rules that only apply to the players. Most of the complaints that I have specifically about critical fumbles, it goes back to something I was trying to explain a few episodes ago when we were talking about old school feel, and I feel like I really didn't articulate it very well. The reason why I don't like crit fails is that critical failures, I feel like they just ultimately make the player characters look like fools. You've got a 1 in 20 chance of critical failing. So you have a 1 in 20 chance of doing something like falling down, dropping your weapon, hitting an ally. I feel like this adds not only a comedic element to the game, but it's a comedic element at the expense of the player characters. I am having the most fun whenever the characters in the game are sincere, even if they're in a ridiculous situation. We can all laugh at the table and have a good time, but I don't want my characters at the table like turning and winking at the camera. It can be actually realistic sometimes for a character to fall down and lose their weapon. It's what happens in real life, but I feel like in my experience, anytime you introduce it into the game, it is always played for laughs. And the reason why I don't do this is because of a character in a quasi 3rd edition game that I was DMing. I had a character who was in a modern-ish setting who was an action movie star. They were a martial arts movie star. And this player could not roll to save their life. They were constantly failing and getting critical failures at the worst time to get critical failures. And it ended up making the character seem like a total joke. And that's absolutely not what the character, not what the player wanted. And I feel like that, yes, there is an aspect of, well, you create a character, but the result of the roles should matter, should evolve the character in some way. But this was a complete tonal shift for the character in that they were utterly incompetent because they kept failing at critical moments. Everybody saw them as a joke. People were looking at them like they were Steven Seagal instead of looking at them like they were Jean-Claude Van Damme. That's my main reason for not wanting to do critical failures. The way I run combat, I do like to narrate damage, and I really like to get into the narration of killing enemies. And I often ask my players, what does it look like? What does it look like as you're attacking? What does it look like as you kill this monster? I've kind of pulled back from doing that as much, to where I'm only asking for players to describe what it looks like whenever they defeat an enemy, because I want the players to have that cinematic moment where they just fucking kill something in a really cool way. And I want the player to have that freedom to make it look as cool as possible. And it ties into why I hate the critical fumbles, is because if I'm describing every action in a particular round, and then that character critically fumbles, and then I have to describe it, it's always going to come across as comedic. Even whenever I'm trying my damnedest to make a situation where the player characters are being sincere in the moment, where they aren't aware that they are in this ridiculous situation, where they are taking it, they are dealing with this shit realistically to how their character should view it. They are in a life and death struggle, and yes, we can laugh about it at the table, but in the character's mind, they are dealing with a situation where things are dying and they could get either killed or maimed in the process. So I don't like that comedic aspect that just feeds in whenever critical failures are in. And I've also been around players who just they view the entire setting as a joke, and they put that into all of their descriptions. And that's partially why I don't ask players to describe every single action that they are doing, because I had a player who literally every single attack that they made, if every single attack that they rolled and they hit, they would describe it, oh, I shoot my bow and it bounces off of the tree and it hits my ally's shield and then goes directly into the enemy's neck. And I roll 1 point of damage. He was at full health. This was the first attack against him. So you just described you shooting this arrow and it lodging itself in its neck after having bounced off of 3 or 4 different things. It's not what I ever want in a game. So that's why I generally don't have the players describe things until the enemy gets down to where it is a dramatic moment. And this is a big moment. I relinquish control and allow the player characters to describe what's happening. The way I describe combat is I try to be more true to what the players' characters are experiencing. So if a character rolls and they get a relatively high roll, but it's not quite enough to hit the enemy, I'll describe how it bounces off of their armor or gets absorbed by the armor or hits the shield or something, or bounces off of some sort of magical effect. I will go into description, and through my description I'll be letting the player characters know what they are dealing with. This is the majority of how the players get a mental image of what the enemies are carrying and what they're wielding, is I will work it into my descriptions during the course of combat. And something narratively that I've added in is kind of a holdover from 4th edition, although it doesn't have any mechanical meaning to it like it did in 4th edition, is I still describe a bloodied condition. And in 4th edition, the bloodied condition happened when a creature dropped below half of its hit points. I still use that as a narrative description just to give the player characters an idea of where they are in the combat against a particular enemy, because I like letting the player characters know how well they are doing in a combat and not keeping everything obfuscated behind the DM screen and I'm just checking off numbers until it drops down unconscious or dead. I like to give a little bit more, and so I always describe when the enemy gets dropped below half hit points. I add some additional little detail to my description, describing how now you finally like dealt an actual blow to them that makes them stand up and pay attention to you, or that, hell, I might even describe like having cut off a part of it, or dented, like put a very significant hindrance, or describe that a particular blow gets in underneath of the armor, and now that you notice that the enemy has a font of blood flowing out from underneath their cuirass. So I use a version of the bloodied condition in 5th edition that carries over from 4th. Next, I want to talk a little bit about flanking, specifically the DMG rule, optional rule of using flanking to give advantage. I personally don't use this rule, and the reason why I use it is I feel like it becomes too easy to gain advantage at that point. Most of the time, melee characters are going to put themselves into a position where they are in flanking in order to get that advantage. And even if they aren't doing it to get advantage, I feel like there's plenty of incentive to get into that situation anyway because of the way that opportunity attacks work. And this is something that goes not only for the player characters but also for the monsters. I said earlier that I really like having multiple enemies for the player characters to fight. So not only will the player characters always be in flanking, but the enemies will always be in flanking as well. And because I very often put more monsters on the table than there are player characters, it always ends up that this is something else that affects the player characters. It puts the characters at too much of a disadvantage because they are usually fighting so many enemies that they are always being flanked. They're always having every attack against them is with advantage, and especially at lower levels. Throw a few goblins at the player characters and you've got some dead player characters, because you're doubling the chances that an enemy will critically hit and take a character down. I've also messed with healing, the way that healing works. I've done where healing outside of combat heals for the maximum. So if a character has cure wounds cast on them outside of combat, it'll heal the maximum. I don't use this anymore. I am one of those people who constantly complains about combats taking forever, and if you make house rules that increase the amount of hit points that the player characters have, you're going to make the combats last longer. So that's why I don't do this anymore. Having said that, I sometimes still play under the rules that drinking a potion can be either done as an action or a bonus action. Whenever I do this, if it's where a potion can be drank as an action or a bonus action, it kind of follows the same rules for spellcasting, where you can't do this twice in one turn. You can only do it once. So you can either drink a potion on your turn, and it either takes an action or a bonus action. And I go back and forth as to whether or not I think this is a good house rule. I like the logic that it takes your full action, because that includes retrieval of the potion. However, I don't like it because where are the potions being kept? Usually the potions are being kept in the backpack unless you've got some other system for working out encumbrance, which is a reference to my slot system that I've house ruled. Usually that item is going to be in the backpack, because where else is it going to be? There's no other rules in D&D 5th edition for where it could go, and it'll take an action in order to go through your backpack and get the item. So I can see the logic in having it take a full action, because most of that action is just going to be retrieval of the item. So I go back and forth as to whether or not I follow this rule or not. More recently, I've just fallen back to doing rules as written, where a potion takes the action, cannot be done on a bonus action. But if you've got a way to logically have a potion at the ready a lot easier than rules as written, I think drinking a potion as a bonus action can make a lot of sense. So as I was kind of creating this list, for all the previous points, I kind of had a flow to them as to going from one topic to another. For the rest of these, I am dropping all pretexts of having a way that these items flow into another. The next point that I often house rule, or I have house ruled, is having a larger party. I had a virtual game where I allowed each player to make 2 PCs, and then in a particular adventure, I had the player decide which character was going to be going on the adventure. This is kind of carried over from 2nd edition Dark Sun, where in that one you were encouraged to have a roster of characters that you would play as, and as you went on an adventure that was more suited for a particular player, then you could play as that character. And it's something that I've really liked the concept of, but then it kind of starts to beg the question of what are these characters doing whenever they're not off on the adventure. I've played where those extra characters are also having concurrent adventures where a particular stretch of time takes place, and the player, like one group of player characters are doing one thing and another group of player characters are doing a separate concurrent adventure. That's a lot of work on the DM to keep up the time scale to make sure that everything works out right, so that everybody is on the same in-game day. I've also done it where whenever the player characters are on their mission, each particular mission or adventure will take place over the course of at least an in-game work week. And during that in-game work week, the player characters who are not on the adventure are back in town doing downtime activities. A criticism of doing a larger party like this is that it really slows down character advancement. Like I said, I did this in an online game, and I was keeping track of experience points, and literally there were twice as many characters going on twice as many adventures in order to reach a particular level. If that's what you want, great, do it that way. I personally really like when it takes a while for the player characters to gain levels. The characters really get the feel for what a particular level is like. You really get a good sense of how to structure encounters at a particular level, because the structure of encounters, what is a challenge for the player characters, does change quite a bit as the players gain in levels and get more powerful. So it allows some extra time to kind of, as a DM, work out that mental math to make sure that the encounters are fun and engaging and difficult. But not all players enjoy having to take twice as much time in order to gain levels. I've also played with allowing sidekicks and encouraging hirelings for the player characters. To be honest, I really haven't had players fully interact with this system yet. Ever since I read Matt Colville's Strongholds and Followers, I've been really wanting to play with a modified version of his rules, but it just hasn't come to pass where I've had a game last long enough that the players could really engage in depth in that of having followers. I'm currently a part of Jordan's first edition game, and followers are a big part of that because it was a big part of previous editions of D&D. I've played with the idea of, in a Planescape game, kind of baking followers into faction benefits as the player characters gain in power or gain in influence in a particular Planescape faction. They have access to more lower level or lower tiered people within that faction. They basically have an entourage that they can then command. And the way that the player characters would gain in level is I would use a variation of the reputation and renown system that appears in the DMG. I actually started to try to play with this in an Eberron game I played about a year ago now, I think. It was a game with Jordan and Kyle and a few others. And reputation just became another spendable resource for the player characters to hoard. And in my game, the player characters never actually got around to using the reputation that they were building up. My modified system had reputation being something that you spent in order to gain a benefit. I created a list of examples of what types of things you could do or get, usually favors for spending reputation. And examples of this might be a certain amount of like spending a point of reputation in order to gain the use of a, like in Sharn, a particular street gang that the player characters had built up some good reputation with. You could spend that reputation to have the gang be basically followers of you, be just extra muscle to go on an adventure with you. And I've also, for additional points of reputation, you could call in bigger favors. You could get more powerful people to come with you on a mission. I also tied it into the system for crafting items, because in Eberron, magic item creation is what House Cannith is known for in Eberron. So of course they had that ability to the player characters had the ability to then spend reputation with House Cannith in order to have access to some of the more powerful magic item creators, so that they could have items made either quicker or for cheaper. Something else I've played around with giving player characters that isn't really an in-game, isn't really a rule thing, but is just something that's more story oriented. I've played around where each in-game work week, the player characters would gain a rumor about just things that were going on in the world. Some of them would be very innocuous things, like just kind of a little bit of detail about a particular aspect of the world. Some of these rumors might be an adventure hook. Some of the rumors might be about the other player characters. I'm a really big fan of having player characters start off, send me a document that gives me some background information. And one of the things that I always ask for in that is, give me 5 rumors from your about your character that are circulating. At least one of them needs to be something that reflects positively on the character. At least one of them needs to be something that reflects negatively on the character. And at least one of them needs to be something that is completely false about the character. So these are things that I help to populate the rumors, the the rumors with. And in a face-to-face group, I basically just printed out a bunch of what these rumors are, just a description of like a small sentence or a very short paragraph on what the rumor is. And for adventures, for the rumors that were adventure seeds, I would often have a couple of rumors circulating about some different aspect of the particular adventure, so that if player characters get these rumors and they decide, oh, we've got 4 rumors and 3 of them sound like they might be related to the same thing, each rumor might give them a little bit of different insight as to what they would need to do in order to complete the particular mission. Going on to the way I handle NPCs and enemies, I've played around with doing morale for NPCs and monsters. Morale is on to page 273 of the DMG. I really like the idea of fights that don't always go to the complete death of one side or the other. Usually the monster's side, usually the enemy's side. I like having I like having the idea of our morale system where the player character, the NPCs, the enemies can be broken and just flee the battle, just get completely routed. However, in practice, I find that more often than not, this causes the player characters to really want to go Nova. And by going Nova, I mean throwing out all of their the biggest things that they have, the most damage dealing, in order to take down the leader of the recognized leader of the bad guys, in order to cause the leader to either break or go down, in order to start a cascade effect. Legitimately, this is how real combat works, but it ends up being much, much harder to create a situation in which the player characters feel like they're in a combat that has serious consequences for them, because they're just, okay, which one's the leader? Okay, everybody pour as much damage as you can onto that leader, and then if any of them are still in the combat, then we'll just take the next strongest one or the next weakest one until they've caused that cascade that causes the combat to be over. As an alternative for finding a way to end combats early, I started doing what I'm calling a hit die tax. This is a variation of some stuff that I've seen in some online discourse. And the way a hit dice tax work is usually I don't do this before 4th level, because fights before then are usually so swingy that I cannot always predict how the combat is going to be ended until the combat has actually ended. And this is something that only I can invoke as the DM. And the way I do a hit die tax in order to end a combat early is, if I see a combat is pretty much over, but there's just a lot of hit points to slog through for the bad guy or the bad guys, I will ask the player characters, hey, do you want to pay a hit die tax in order to end the combat at this point? And we'll just narrate the end of the combat with you guys winning. However, the hit dice tax will be that since there are 4 of you, you'll need to pay 4 hit dice right now in order to end combat now, and the combat is over. We'll narrate the end. No further hits are taken, but the hit dice that all of your characters have need to be paid. The reason why I like this is, 1, it allows me to end combats early, and 2, it allows for particularly characters who are on the back lines, who maybe haven't been hit throughout the entirety of a combat, to actually pay a cost in the combat in hit dice. Even though they didn't actually take damage, it takes a hit die away from their hit dice for the day. And I also have where if I impose a 4 hit dice tax, it's not required that each character pay 1 hit die. If one of the characters in the back wants to pay all of them because they're still sitting at the maximum hit points, but the 2 melee characters, they have gotten severely beaten down and they need to hold on to their hit dice in order to heal up during a short rest. The player who is in the back lines and didn't get hit during the combat, and rarely if ever gets hit, they still have to pay something in order to end the combat. So I feel like that strikes a really good balance, and it makes characters in the back use their hit dice, which most of the time they end up not using their hit dice. I don't pull this very often. Usually the time I pull this is whenever I'm just sick and tired of combat and all of the tension has been removed from the encounter. We're just down to slogging through a bunch of dice rolls in order to get the monsters down to 0 hit points. At that point, I'll invoke this rule. And if the player characters don't want to pay the hit dice tax, they don't have to. We can continue the slog of combat for the next half hour or however long it takes in order to go through the rounds of combat to get to the end. I like it because it allows me the option of ending the combat early, and it still costs the players something in order to get through the combat. I've also played with the way that monsters work in combat. The most popular one that I've used is, in order to specifically speed up combat, is to have monster hit points halved, but their damage is doubled. I'll be honest, in this system, critical hits are fucking brutal. That's the main reason why I don't continue to use it. It doesn't take very many lucky rolls on my part in order to just deal out an ungodly amount of damage to the frontline fighter, who then goes down, and then player characters are suddenly dealing with something that deals a lot of damage that they aren't normally used to dealing with. So instead, if I'm trying to speed up combat, and particularly in face-to-face games, what I'll do is, instead of rolling the damage for monsters and NPCs, they just deal the average damage that is listed in the DMG, or I'm sorry, that's listed along with the entry in the monster manual. This isn't really a house rule because it's right there in the rules. It's just an optional rule. I use this face-to-face. This is how I play monsters. If they do manage a critical, then I will actually roll the way I'm supposed to. But just for everyday hits, I just use the value that is in the value that's in the monster manual for the static damage. And the reason why I only do this face-to-face is because, once again, virtual tabletop is a different situation. Because I can set it up in a virtual tabletop to automatically roll the damage dice for me every single time the monsters roll, it takes no additional time to deal damage, so I don't use it in virtual tabletops. Something that I've been doing in virtual tabletops is, particularly for pre-planned encounters, I will go through and actually roll the hit points for each individual monster that is there on the map. It's very easy to do. It's just clicking a button and it'll spit out the result of how many hit dice or how many hit points a particular monster have. It adds a nice bit of variation so that the player characters don't know exactly they know exactly what they're facing. They just don't know how many hit points it has. That adds a very nice dynamic to combats, especially at low levels, because I know for a fact that there are a lot of players who, whenever they're playing on virtual tabletops, they will sit there either with a PDF of the monster manual open, or they will sit there with a open to D&D Beyond, or they'll have an actual book open to the monster, and they will be looking at the monster stats right there in the middle of combat. At the table, this is really hard to do without the DM noticing. I don't like it that the players do this, but it's a fact that the players can do this, and I would never know. And so to avoid a player knowing exactly what they are facing, that's why I typically will roll the monster hit points in virtual tabletops, just to throw the players for a curve. A little bit ago, I alluded to using minions. This is something that I've carried over from 4th edition, kind of. The way that minions worked in 4th edition was that a minion was a 1-hit point creature that was a leveled threat against the player characters. It's just that it was very easy to take out. The minion had a pretty good chance of actually connecting. The minion dealt minimal damage to the player characters, but in large enough groups, they were still a threat. So I've said I liked using groups of monsters, and in order to prevent the fucking headache of tracking the hit points of 5 or 6 different monsters on the playing field, I make some of the minions. And what this usually means is that I will give a particular monster a boost on their attack bonus to where they are a threat to a character in full plate and a shield. They will then deal minimum damage, and by minimum damage, I would assume that the damage die they rolled would be a 1, and then any bonus damage that they have on top of that. And that feels like a good enough threat to all of the player characters at the table that whenever the minion gets hit by a successful attack, they will go down. They will also go down if they fail a saving throw against a damage-dealing spell. So this means that a group of minions who are hit by a fireball, I will roll saving throws for each one of them. The ones that succeeded on their saving throws, they're still in the combat, but all of the ones that failed, they're all dead. Don't have to track hit points. I can just make a single roll to determine whether a particular minion is up or down at any given time. I feel like this adds a great dynamic to the combats, and it keeps low-level monsters on a degree of parity with the player characters to where they are still threats to them at higher levels. All around, I think that the minion rules was a huge oversight from carrying over from 4th edition. Something that I have done to make running the game a lot easier, and also something that I have offered other DMs to do, is either me as a DM asking somebody to assist me, or me as the player offering to assist the DM. Usually this is in the form of having a designated player keep track of initiative. You would not believe how much mental load this frees up from the DM, not having to keep track of initiative. It allows the DM to focus on what's going on at a particular time, and especially if you've got a player who just their attention wanders, either making that player keep track of initiative, or having the player who is designated as the one keeping track of initiative, they give out warnings of not only whose turn it currently is, but also giving a warning to the player or the character whose turn is coming up. I feel like this is a great way to speed up combat, because then you don't run into the issue of a character learning it's their turn, then they look at the board to figure out what's going on, then they make their decision of what they're going to do, and then they roll their dice. The player who is on deck can start figuring out their turn and start assembling their dice on what they're going to be doing on their turn. I feel like in every way this speeds up combat, and it, like I said, it eases the DM's mental load because it's one less thing to worry about. If I really trust the player or the players, I also have either the player who is tracking initiative, or I have a different player keep track of the amount of damage that the monsters have taken. This is another thing that takes up a huge amount of DM's mental load, and putting it off on a player is great. Whenever I have a player keeping track of the damage that monsters have taken, I do not tell the players how many hit points the monsters have. Instead, I just have the players count up each time they gain damage. So damage is gained rather than hit points are lost. Then At the end of each attack, I have the player who's keeping track of this tell me how much damage the monster has gained. And then I can consult to see whether or not the particular monster has dropped or not. If you've never played with these two little house rules where where there's a player keeping track of the initiative and there's a player keeping track of damage, I promise you it will evolve your game and make it even more fun. If there is any advice here that I stand behind more than anything, it is those 2 points. If you get nothing else out of this episode, please try this. Let me know how it works, because I stand by it that much. The last thing that I'm going to be talking about, not really a house rule. Well, kind of is a house rule. That is the rule of cool. I have a really hard time following the rule of cool. Anybody who slogged through the last episode knows how much of a stickler for the rules I can be. But I'm trying to be a better DM. I'm trying to get better at this game, and fully implementing the rule of cool is one of the last hurdles that I need to get over in order to really become an awesome DM. And the reason why I don't follow the rule of cool, just kind of, I don't have a good excuse, but the reason why I have such a hard time with it is that I have had quite a few players in the past just trying to take advantage of the DM. They've had the mentality of playing the game against the DM. And that is a mentality that I absolutely hate, because in a lot of ways, I feel like I'm there trying to present a fun game. We're all there to have fun, and we're all there to make the best story we all can together. And more often than not, whenever I have a player who is asking for something that, if I could look at it objectively, I would see it as a pretty cool thing to do. But in the moment when the player is asking to do something that is outside the rules, my mind immediately jumps to, wait, how are you trying to fuck me over? And when I have a moment to think, when I have the distance from the game, I can realize that I'm doing this and that it's a major problem of mine. But in the moment, it's just so goddamn hard to get over. So hopefully that's a little bit of an insight as to why I kind of went off on people last episode. I'm not saying that I was justified. I recognize that this is a problem that I have, but I'm trying to do better. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me rant and rave for however long this episode ends up being, after I cut out all of the 10, 15, 30 seconds of silence where I try to compose myself. Thank you very much for listening. It's time for me to stop this bullshit and start planning my next game. Thank you very much. This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.